"Security will escort you out," she said without even looking up. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just tapped on her damn screen like she was ordering a latte. That was the moment I knew she hadn't read the fine print. Not in the contracts, not in the credential protocols, not in the one clause that mattered more than her smirking little power trip. I slid the badge out of my pocket, turned, not to her, but to the lawyer seated at her left, and handed it to him without a word. He took it casually at first, like it was just a formality, some disposable trinket from the IT basement. Then he actually looked at it, froze. His face dropped like a stone in water. "Ma'am," he said, voice going thin, "about the board meeting. Get forensics on this badge, now." Hey, real quick before we keep going. 97% of people who watch these stories never subscribe, and it means the world to our team when you do. If you're into real stories with real consequences, hit that like button and subscribe. It's free, it helps more than you know, and we've got so much more to tell. Anyway, let's rewind a bit. Most folks in the office didn't know my name. They knew of me. Maybe I was the one who handled systems. Quiet woman, 40-something, worked down on 15 near the server cage. I didn't do social lunches. I didn't show up in branded hoodies at all hands. But if you ever tried to finalize a board comp package or move digital assets through any of the locked pipelines, my credentials were the ones that let you in, or didn't. The joke in the infrastructure team was that I was a ghost with root access. I liked it that way. People don't screw with ghosts. Then came Sierra Vance, barely into her 30s, straight from a VC darling startup that burned fast and bright. They called her disruptive, like that was a compliment. Her entrance was grand, new signage, new slogans, weekly video memos where she said words like decentralize and move fast. She brought in consultants who smiled too much, asked too few questions, and started suggesting things that would have made our old CTO scream into a pillow. One week in, I was pulled from a scheduled credential rollout to attend a meeting titled System Redundancy Rationalization. Translation: figure out which people could be cut because someone's nephew found a cheaper app. Sierra didn't even stay for the whole meeting. She sent her chief of staff, Vin, a man who looked like he'd just walked off a yacht. He stared at my slides for 3 seconds and said, "Can we not just migrate this to the cloud?" I remember blinking, slowly, then asking, which part exactly? The lineage tracker? The credential loopback? The board override authentication tree? He smiled like I'd just handed him a Sudoku puzzle. Look, we're simplifying. The old guard just slows us down. The thing was, my systems were the cloud. The kind that runs through encrypted loops tied to our executive protocols and bound by contractual triggers buried so deep even legal had to schedule time to figure them out. I was the old guard, sure, but I'd designed the damn gates, and I knew exactly what they'd trip if you fired the wrong person the wrong way. So I started listening more than I talked. I took notes, logged everything, and when their so-called back-end simplification team started asking about badge credentialing workflows, I told them what they wanted to hear. It's all handled. They didn't ask how, or by whom, or what sat inside the final layer of firmware on the oldest badge in the system. Badge 7.3. Mine. Clause 44B was buried in a governance sub-protocol Sierra clearly hadn't read. It linked all legacy executive credentials to a central certificate holder, me, and it required full board approval to deactivate. Not a CEO, not even the chair on their own. A vote. Unanimous. Otherwise, if the key holder was terminated without protocol, the badge itself initiated a governance lockout cascade. I'd built it 3 years ago, with board knowledge, under the last CEO who'd once said to me over a glass of flat ginger ale in the executive lounge, "You're our insurance policy." Sierra never asked why her voice authorization pinged twice every time she tried to move equity, never questioned the tiny delay in her asset sign-off console, and when she gave the command to escort her out, me, the woman holding the skeleton key to every authenticated action inside the company, she thought she was cleaning house. Instead, she kicked a wire she didn't know existed. The room hadn't even cooled when the badge hit that lawyer's palm and rewrote the tone of the entire morning. His expression alone, worth every hour I'd spent in silence, every late-night protocol test, every piece of code that whispered, "Don't poke the ghost." And Sierra, still tapping on her screen, still pretending she understood the game she just lost before it even started. They thought I'd flinch, that I'd panic like some underpaid sysadmin who just realized her clearance was next on the chopping block. But I didn't flinch. I logged everything. It started small, like it always does. A new contractor with too many buzzwords, not enough questions. A Slack invite to a channel called Wata Backend Accelerators. A Google Doc titled Kill List Legacy Systems. Cute. They moved fast. Too fast. One day, our admin token architecture was untouched. The next, I saw plaintext keys floating in internal dev chat. No MFA, no logging, no chain of custody. I ran an internal diagnostic on the session records. Found 7 logins from third-party IPs with escalated privileges, all of them stamped with contractor accounts. New ones I didn't provision. My system sent up alerts, red flags, automated warnings. I sat in my quiet office on 15, sipping bad coffee, watching my dashboard light up like it was Christmas in hell. I raised it to Vin first, forwarded the flags, asked for an emergency rollback. His reply? We'll loop you in if it escalates. For now, just let the new team do their thing. Sure, let the new team run API calls with God mode access through an unsecured endpoint labeled test2.backdoor.dev. What could possibly go wrong? Then came the kicker. I walked into a Wednesday morning alignment meeting and Vin hit me with it right between the eyes, like he was doing me a favor. You're not essential anymore. Like I was a removable ink cartridge. Not, you're being transitioned or restructured. Just that. Not essential. Like the quiet woman who'd built the spine of their digital governance was now some outdated thumb drive to be tossed in a drawer. I nodded. Didn't argue, didn't show my hand. Because buried in my badge's firmware, deep in the provisioning codebase that none of their shiny contractors ever bothered to audit, was something they'd never understand until it was too late. Clause 44B. 3 years ago, I'd proposed it as a failsafe. A digital deadman switch buried beneath the credential assignment protocol. A board-signed clause that bound executive override capabilities to a central certificate. Mine. If that credential was deactivated without unanimous board consent, the system would trigger a lockdown. Everything from equity transactions to investor comms to board quorum verifications would freeze. Every door marked executive would turn into a wall. And I didn't just write the code. I owned the signature key. No one else could open it, not even legal. Sierra had never heard of it. Why would she? She'd been too busy approving branding updates and trying to look like a Forbes cover story. She never noticed that every time she logged into a governance console, the system quietly echoed a verification ping to my key, my badge. So when they started wiping out logs, replacing credential structures, ripping out the safety layers like they were weeds in a garden, what they were really doing was building a bonfire under their own seats. And I just sat there, letting it happen. Watching the system load the gun, knowing they'd be the ones to pull the trigger. Because in their rush to erase the past, they forgot one crucial rule. You don't delete the architect while the building's still standing. Not unless you want the whole thing to come down on your damn head. It happened on a Tuesday. 8:57 a.m., not a minute early. I was buzzed to the 18th floor, glass conference room, end of the hall. No calendar invite, no subject line, just Vin's voice on the line. Can you come up for a quick conversation? Funny how conversation in corporate dialect always translates to firing squad. I stepped into the room and there she was, Sierra, leaning back in one of those overpriced ergonomic chairs with her heels kicked up against the frame. She didn't even bother looking up, just held out a single sheet of paper like she was handing off a receipt for dry cleaning. Security will escort you out, she said. That was it. No, thank you. No, this isn't personal. Not even a fake HR line about reorgs or strategic realignment. Just that cold, smug startup cadence like she was checking off a task before her next avocado toast break. 2 guards shifted behind me, barely hiding their awkwardness. Vin stood in the corner, arms folded, pretending he was somewhere else. And the corporate counsel, Bradley, I think his name was, sat to Sierra's left with a legal pad and his attention fixed on a laptop. I looked down at the paper. It wasn't even warm from a printer. They'd probably signed this days ago. I reached into my coat pocket, and that's when it all shifted. Not a folder, not a protest, not even a last-ditch speech to defend my relevance. Just a badge. Badge 173. I didn't hand it to her. I turned to Bradley, met his eyes, and placed it gently into his open palm. For a split second, he didn't react. Probably thought it was a gesture of compliance, of someone going quietly. Then he looked at it. I watched it happen. The freeze, the intake of breath. His eyebrows drew together like someone had just shown him a severed finger in a Ziploc bag. He blinked once, then twice. His lips parted. "Ma'am," he said, voice suddenly brittle. "About the board meeting." Sierra still hadn't looked up. She was texting someone, thumb moving in fast little taps. She didn't hear the crack in his voice. "Ma'am," he repeated, louder this time, and she glanced at him, annoyed. "Get forensics on this badge. Now." Silence hit the room like a fire door slamming shut. Sierra paused mid-scroll, her head tilted just slightly like a dog hearing a strange sound for the first time. "What are you talking about?" she asked. "Slow now. Careful." Bradley didn't answer her directly. He flipped the badge over, looked at the embedded chip, the ID code burned into the polycarbonate. His expression didn't change, but he sat straighter, reached for his laptop with both hands. Vin finally unfolded his arms. The two guards behind me didn't move, but I saw them exchange a glance. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. That badge wasn't just plastic and proximity triggers. It was an active credential tied to the legacy core, a governance access certificate that, under Clause 44B, required unanimous board approval to deactivate. And deactivation without that approval? Automatic lockdown, transaction freezes, quorum invalidation, system-wide protocol halt. My badge was the tripwire, and Sierra, in her infinite ignorance, had just yanked it without checking which wire was which. The expression on her face finally changed. Her posture stiffened, eyes darting between Bradley and me. She was calculating. I could almost see her trying to backpedal through the legal minefield she hadn't known she'd been dancing through. But it was too late. The badge was active. The system had already logged the removal. The lockout cascade had started the second I'd crossed the room. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something, maybe to call it back, maybe to bluff, but Bradley cut her off. "Do not touch your laptop," he said, sharper than I'd ever heard him, "and do not send another message." That's when she finally looked scared. Just a flicker, but it was there. They wanted a purge. They just triggered their own exorcism. And I, quiet, forgettable me, was no longer the ghost behind the firewall. I was the firewall, and they'd just tried to burn it down from the inside. It hit them all at once, like the oxygen in the room had been quietly siphoned off, and nobody noticed until they couldn't breathe. Bradley's laptop lit up with warning logs. Sierra leaned over to look, trying to mask it as curiosity, but I could see her throat tighten as her eyes moved faster and faster across the screen. Vin finally pulled his phone out and tapped something under the table, probably messaging IT or whatever husk of an infrastructure team they hadn't alienated yet. The badge I'd carried for half a decade was more than just a keycard. It was the heartbeat of their internal control systems. Sierra had just authorized the removal of the one credential that every layer of their digital governance silently depended on, and she had done it without even glancing at the back-end contract that came with it. Clause 44B. It wasn't some IT footnote. It was a board-ratified protocol, one I'd drafted myself. Reviewed by compliance, signed into permanence by our former legal chief after a near breach during the Veritas acquisition. Back then, the board had wanted an unbreachable chain of trust, something that couldn't be rerouted or hijacked without full, verified, eyes-on accountability. And the solution we'd built? Any master credential marked executive auth legacy, especially the root badge, mine, could not be revoked without a unanimous board vote. No CEO override, no back-channel authority, because that badge didn't just grant access. It was the keystone for the encryption lattice work that verified everything from equity issuances to boardroom vote tallies. Remove it improperly, and the system didn't just alert. It retaliated. I had coded it that way. Not out of malice, out of protection. We'd seen what happened when tech governance was treated like a convenience store buzzer. People cut corners. People got sloppy. Or worse, ambitious, like Sierra. She had no idea what she'd triggered. Across the room, Bradley muttered under his breath, typing frantically. Then his screen pinged with a live access lock report. Credential. Jabaloza 173, Executive Root Certificate. Flagged for improper deactivation. Lockdown protocol initiated. He froze again, looked at me, this time with something bordering on reverence or fear, maybe both. Sierra broke first. Okay, what does that mean exactly? She snapped, voice rising as she turned to Bradley. He didn't answer right away, probably because the follow-up messages were hitting his inbox in real time. Quorum validation, failed. Voting rights, suspended. Transaction queue, frozen. What does it mean, Bradley? I could have told her. It meant no investor calls could proceed, no board action could be certified, no stock options could be executed. It meant the company's governance engine had just thrown itself into a self-sealed cryptographic cocoon, all because the one person who was supposed to be a legacy safeguard had been terminated like a temp. And more than anything, it meant they couldn't fix it without me. I kept my arms relaxed at my sides, didn't gloat, didn't move. I just watched the realization drip across their faces like a slow oil spill. Vin whispered something to Sierra, who shot him a look like he'd just suggested cannibalism. Bradley closed his laptop softly, the way you do when you're trying to stop the bleeding. I could see the building dread in Sierra's posture now, that perfect straight spine starting to curve just a bit, that rigid confidence finally melting as she turned fully toward me for the first time since I walked in. Why wasn't I told about this clause? She asked, voice now controlled, sharp. Bradley didn't answer, because the truth was brutal. She had been told. It was in her onboarding materials, in the credentialing brief I'd personally signed and routed, in the documentation she'd clicked through at record speed before posting about reinventing legacy. She just didn't read it. And now the thing she didn't take the time to understand was grinding her entire executive ecosystem to a halt. All from a single badge, and the woman they'd just told wasn't essential. She reached for her phone. Not with the calm detachment of a CEO making moves, but with the sweaty, jittery urgency of someone realizing she'd just tripped a wire wired straight to the foundation. Sierra tapped in her PIN twice before she got it right, and then mumbled into the receiver with the kind of hushed, frantic tone you only hear from people who suddenly understand the hole they've dug goes all the way down. While she called IT, my systems called me. Audit logs began populating across the secure channel I'd left open the night before, in a side panel they didn't even know existed. Flags bloomed in red, stacking line by line. Unauthorized executive access. Credential chain invalidated. Root key removed. Badge. Norbert 173. Bradley was watching the same flood on his screen. I could see the reflection in his glasses, each ping, each red flag, each failed override code bouncing back like a slap. Badge 7-3 wasn't just a badge, it was a governance kernel. 19 board-level permissions were coded into its metadata. That included vote authentication, IPO readiness confirmations, and embedded equity transfer approvals that fed directly into the SEC reporting pipeline. Sierra hadn't just fired a technician, she'd yanked the master circuit while the engine was still running at 90 men per hour. And the best part? Her third-party contractor audit missed it entirely, because I'd made damn sure they would. 3 years ago, after the Veritas panic, the board gave me a blank check to embed a fail-safe. They wanted something undetectable to casual auditors, something that couldn't be reverse engineered, couldn't be patched out by accident, and couldn't be tampered with without tripping internal legal alerts. I delivered exactly what they asked for. But I went one step further. I embedded the kernel underneath the standard credentialing layer, nested it inside the firmware, just above the boot protocol, but below anything you could access through an admin panel. You could plug the badge into 100 readers and never see it. But the moment you tried to sever its access without triggering the proper board authorization chain, system lockdown. Immediate. Total. Sierra's pet consultants hadn't even asked about legacy firmware. They assumed everything had been modernized. That's what you get when your audit team's biggest achievement is a Medium post about flattening the stack. Now, every door marked executive voting rights was blinking yellow. Transactional smart contracts were frozen mid-process. The next investor call, the one Sierra had prepped for all week, was already auto-canceled by a smart rule I wrote 4 fiscal years ago. She didn't just lock herself out of a system. She declared war on a framework that was designed to bury anyone who disrespected it. Her voice in the background was climbing. "What do you mean it's hard-coded?" "No, I don't have a second route. Why the hell would there only be one?" Bradley cleared his throat and spoke quietly. "Because that's how you signed it." She didn't respond. Not verbally, at least, but her face told the story loud and clear. That mixture of white-hot anger and ice-cold dread, boiling over behind a carefully moisturized facade. I'd seen it before. It was the same expression our previous CFO wore the day he tried to sneak through a bonus acceleration clause without informing the board, until the system flagged the unauthorized transfer and routed it to my inbox. Clause 44B was never a suggestion. It was a commandment. And now, like a trapdoor in a rigged courtroom, it had opened right beneath her Gucci loafers. Vin finally tried to intervene. "Isn't there a workaround?" he asked, like a man asking if a dead battery could be fixed by shaking the car. "There is," Bradley said. Sierra looked up like he'd handed her a life raft. "Okay, what is it?" He didn't look at her. He looked at me. "It requires reauthorization by the original certificate holder." Her silence thudded like a body hitting a basement floor, because for all her talk of innovation, of disruption, of cutting out the dead wood, she'd forgotten one thing. You don't uproot the roots, not without everything above them falling flat. And I was the root. Still active, still smiling, still holding the one credential that said this company listens to me before it breathes. By 9:06 a.m., the executive floor was in full-blown triage mode. I sat quietly in the corner of the same glass room they'd tried to boot me from less than 20 minutes earlier, sipping the coffee no one had remembered to take away. Sierra's assistant was pacing hard enough to leave tread marks in the carpet, while her calls kept bouncing between disconnected IT leads and panicked external consultants who had suddenly gone very, very silent. The 9:30 investor Q&A was still showing on everyone's calendars. The flagship quarterly call. Media would be on it. Shareholders, analysts. Hell, even a few regulatory observers, given our pre-IPO positioning. It was supposed to be Sierra's victory lap. Her big, we modernize the dinosaur moment. Except now, the call wouldn't start. The system wouldn't allow it, because the quorum authentication couldn't be verified. See, Ellison's governance platform wasn't just for show. The vote chain had to validate at least 3 specific executive signatures tied to their roles and functions: CEO, CFO, chair proxy. All 3 depended on valid credentials. All 3 passed through my badge as a certification anchor, and since the system had registered mine as improperly terminated without clause 44B compliance, invalidated. All of it. A hard regulatory lock triggered automatically, freezing outbound transactions, equity events, and any sensitive updates flagged for material risk exposure. The smart contract engine, powered by our own proprietary chain of trust software, spun into full compliance lockdown. Sierra didn't understand half the words coming out of legal's mouth, but she understood this. The board would be on that call, and right now, she couldn't log in. Neither could the CFO. Neither could the chair proxy. And worst of all, I could, from anywhere. That's when the shouting started. Not dramatic movie shouting, more like the strained whisper-yell desperation of a CEO realizing she no longer owned the show she was supposed to host. Her assistant, poor thing, tried everything. He attempted to reset the credentials manually through admin override. The screen blinked once, then displayed, permission denied, locked under legacy governance clause. He tried to reroute the quorum through a backup credentialing proxy. Flagged, unverified certificate source, SEC notification issued. They didn't know yet that I'd already sent a memo to the SEC under my consulting LLC, Ironcrest Systems, at 7:42 a.m., time-stamped, encrypted, and CC'd to 3 separate compliance officers. The subject line was simple: governance violation at Ellison Stratton Group, Clause 44B triggered by improper termination. Inside, I detailed the entire chain of events, complete with internal screenshots, legal context, and a time-stamped copy of the original clause from our executive governance charter. Attached was a formal statement from Ironcrest asserting an unauthorized override of credential authority and the triggering of automated compliance locks. That memo wasn't just a paper trail, it was a spotlight. And now the heat from that spotlight was turning every quiet moment in Sierra's office into an interrogation chamber. Legal asked her flat out, "Did you get unanimous board approval before deactivating the root credential?" She hesitated. That was enough. "No," she finally said, like she was trying to spit out a bad taste. "It was a legacy credential. Obsolete." "Legacy doesn't mean optional," Bradley said, arms folded. "And now we have a non-compliant event reported to the SEC before our quarterly call, which, by the way, cannot proceed." Someone tried to restart the call manually. The system kicked back another message. "Investor quorum lock. Resolution authority credential holder. NAI ISO 173 external consultant." The room turned toward me, still seated, still sipping, still ghost-level calm. I didn't say anything, didn't offer to fix it, just waited. Because the longer they squirmed, the clearer it became to everyone watching. This wasn't a technical hiccup, it was a governance collapse. And Sierra Vance had pulled the pin herself. They thought they were dealing with a silent IT relic. Turns out, I was the last firewall between them and federal compliance violations. And now that the regulators were watching, every mistake was going to count double. By Thursday morning, the heat had turned surgical. The chairman received a 42-page report compiled by legal, compliance, and 2 external governance advisors who were now being paid hazard rates to dissect what the hell had just happened. The centerpiece of the report was clean, brutal, and impossible to spin. The credential authority trace ran directly through me, through my badge, through my Ironcrest signature on every flagged system certificate from the past 3 fiscal years. No ambiguity, no wiggle room. At the bottom of page 6, bolded in red, "Improper termination of executive auth legacy root certificate holder without board vote, clause 44B violation." On page 10, "Governance cascade triggered, SEC informed prior to internal remediation." Page 14, "Credential reinstatement, unavailable without holder authorization, external consultant. Independent legal entity, Ironcrest Systems, LLC." There it was, in black and white. Sierra hadn't just made a mess, she'd violated internal charter law, broadcasted it to federal oversight, and triggered a governance chain reaction that made it impossible for the board to ignore. Her authority to terminate me had been procedurally invalid. Worse, her refusal to reverse course after the system locked down had only deepened the breach. I didn't have to be in the room when the conversation happened. I know the tone, the quiet voices, the language people use when the damage is permanent, and the only thing left is how gently you can make someone walk the plank. I heard through my attorney that the chairman didn't yell, didn't blame, just slid the folder across the table and said, "You need to consider what's best for the company." Translation: resign or be publicly defrocked by our own governance code. That afternoon, Sierra stepped away to focus on personal priorities. No press statement, no LinkedIn farewell post. Just a one-line update in the shareholder portal and a terse out-of-office reply that said she'd be unavailable for an extended period. Meanwhile, Ironcrest Systems submitted a formal response, not a victory lap, not a vindictive memo, just a simple release letter pending final license settlement. It included a line item for breach of credential continuity, reviewed and verified by internal counsel and backed by our digital governance logs. Clause 44B remediation fee, $6.7 million. Not a demand, a fact. See, the clause had been written with a contingency rate in the event of improper override. It was built into the service agreement we signed back when the governance kernel was first embedded, contingent not on harm, but on procedural breach. And because Sierra had terminated the credential without fulfilling protocol, the penalty stood. They could have read the clause at any time. She just never thought the quiet woman in the server wing was the clause. The call came late Thursday night. My attorney picked up, listened, smiled, then simply said, "We'll confirm receipt once funds clear." That was it. No more escalations, no legal threats, just resignation in both senses of the word. They didn't just lose a CEO, they paid me 7 figures to make sure the company could keep breathing. All because she thought I was obsolete. Turns out I was the failsafe, and I'd been patient, professional, but never, ever expendable. She made the mistake of pulling the trigger on a system she never understood. And the cost? Exactly $6.7 million paid in full. The next board meeting was held in the West Conference Suite, 1 floor below the glass tomb where they'd tried to cut me loose. Governance reset protocol was the first item on the agenda, quietly worded, clinically executed. All executive badges, revoked and reissued. Clean slates, fresh digital keys, new security layers embedded with 2-factor biometric constraints. All except one, mine. Iron Crest Systems was issued a permanent passive observer credential, non-voting, but immutable. A ghost presence in the infrastructure logs. Always watching, never overridden, never removed. A reminder. The chairman didn't mention my name. No one did. But the clause that created the role was read aloud, recorded, and signed off by every member present. I knew the words by heart. I'd written them 3 years ago. Sierra's name? Gone. Not suspended. Not temporarily reassigned. Just scrubbed. Her resignation letter, released to the public later that week, made no mention of governance errors or the internal breach that had stalled the investor call. No one talked about Clause 44B or the lockdown cascade that followed. But the tech press? They always find the smoke. One small blog out of Seattle, governance nerds, ex-DevOps types, dug up the SEC memo I'd filed. Quietly, cleanly, with full time-stamped attachments and audit trails. The headline wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. The 6.7 Manners badge, how one credential froze a company. It wasn't shared widely, not viral, but the right people read it. Industry insiders, governance analysts, a few boardroom consultants who understood what it meant when a root credential didn't just grant access. It held power. I wasn't listed in the article, just the original architect of Ellison Stratton's internal governance kernel. That was fine. Let Sierra chase spotlights. I'd spent 5 years building a system designed to outlive vanity, ego, and the kind of leadership that thought governance was optional. Now, every time a new executive was onboarded, they passed through the same provisioning framework, same verification flow, same back-end signature, and buried beneath it all? Iron Crest. Not a name on a door, just a line of code that hummed beneath the foundation. You don't need to speak loudly when your architecture whispers the truth into every transaction. Sierra tried to erase me. Instead, she erased herself. And the system? It remembered exactly who wrote its laws. Months passed. Ellison Stratton Group moved on like companies always do, polished new initiatives, fresher branding, a CEO who knew when to speak and when to listen. They called it a new chapter in their quarterly letter, all tidy fonts and confident tone, as if governance hadn't flatlined in front of the entire executive tier just weeks earlier. But systems remember, the new CEO came from legal, precise, composed, careful with every step she took inside the framework I'd left behind. She didn't rip anything out, didn't poke the ghost. She kept the clause in place, retired the override attempts, and quietly ensured that Ironcrest systems remained in the documentation. No speech, no award, just one line, buried in the technical appendix of the annual compliance log. Credential continuity maintained per governance remediation terms. Ironcrest systems. And in the 10K filed that spring? One sentence, middle of page 214, remediation license paid. Ironcrest Systems LLC. The amount? Sealed. But everyone knew. You don't settle 7 figures for a malfunction. You settle 7 figures for survival. Inside the data center logs, buried in the credential heartbeat systems, one light still blinks. Quiet. Steady. Once a year, during proxy season, when the board system runs its full-spectrum authentication and governance chain reconciliation, it pings every cert holder across the executive stack. And at the end of that sequence, it pings me, not me personally, of course. Ironcrest. The credential still tied to badge Ndabag user 173, a ghost key no one can remove. Not because I demanded it, but because the system was written that way. Because I wrote it that way. It doesn't ring, doesn't flash, doesn't notify the public or trigger a confetti banner in some Slack channel. It just pings. One quiet handshake with a passive observer credential that never expired. They tried to erase the woman. But the system? The system still knows who its architect is. And in that quiet blink, every March, just before the board signs off on another year of imagined control, it whispers back to the ghost behind the firewall, still here.